In 2018, the quiet departure of one man sent a shockwave through the entertainment industry. There was no farewell, no tribute, no curtain call for the producer whose shows had once shaped the after-school lives of millions across the United States. Instead, Dan Schneider slipped out of Nickelodeon the way a shadow leaves a brightly lit room. Suddenly, silently, and without explanation. For more than 2 decades, he had been the driving force behind the network's most iconic live-action series, a figure whose creative influence reached into living rooms and childhood memories across the country. Yet beneath the vivid colors and relentless laughter of those shows, a far more complicated narrative had been forming. Concerns, once whispered in hallways, began resurfacing with new weight. Moments once dismissed as eccentric now appeared in a different light. And when Nickelodeon cut ties with him, it didn't feel like a transition. It felt like a fracture. A fracture in the image of a man long celebrated for joy and imagination, and a fracture in the trust viewers had placed in the world he helped create. This is the story of how power and fame built Dan Schneider's empire, and how the accusations that followed would ripple through everything he had touched, revealing the shadows waiting just behind the smiles. Before controversy clouded his legacy, Dan Schneider existed in the public imagination as a kind of architect of childhood fantasy. To millions of American households, he wasn't a recognizable face, but a recognizable presence, the creative force whose name flashed briefly in the credits before every episode that kids eagerly waited for after school. His productions carried a signature energy, fast-paced humor, brightly lit sets, quirky characters who broke the rules in ways young viewers found liberating. Inside Nickelodeon, executives saw him as something even more valuable, a dependable engine of hits, capable of turning simple premises into franchises that defined entire eras of youth television. Parents viewed the shows as harmless entertainment, laced with innocence and imaginative fun, and children felt a genuine attachment to the world he helped build. In an industry constantly searching for the next trend, Schneider offered stability. His track record made him untouchable, his instincts were trusted, and his influence grew in ways few predicted. The surface image was glossy, successful, and reassuring. But like any well-constructed set, there was space behind the backdrop, places where the audience never looked, and where the story of Dan Schneider's rise was already beginning to feel more complex than the cheerful facade suggested. As Nickelodeon pushed into a new era of live-action programming, Dan Schneider's rise inside the network was not sudden. It unfolded quietly, steadily, like a tide that kept returning with greater force each year. Early on, he had been seen as a writer with unusual instincts, someone who understood the rhythm of youth comedy and could turn awkward moments into scenes audiences remembered. But as each show he touched gained momentum, something shifted in the balance of power. Executives began deferring to his judgment. Casting decisions moved through him. Entire production schedules bent around his creative impulses. What had once been collaboration gradually transformed into an ecosystem built around a single voice. With every new hit, Schneider's authority expanded, not through loud demands, but through the network's growing reliance on his success. He became the gravitational center of Nickelodeon's live-action universe. Projects orbited him, young performers sought his approval, and staff learned quickly that the smooth functioning of a show often depended on understanding his moods. The brighter his shows became on screen, the deeper his influence settled behind the scenes. And in that widening space between creative freedom and unchecked authority, the culture surrounding him began to warp, setting the stage for the complexities that would later rise to the surface. As Schneider's influence solidified, the atmosphere within the productions he led began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. Crew members recalled how the energy on set often fluctuated with his presence. Moments of light-hearted collaboration could turn tense without warning, replaced by a quiet rigidity that signaled his approval or disapproval long before he spoke. Writers described brainstorming sessions where creativity felt abundant yet fragile, as if ideas floated freely only until Schneider's reaction determined which ones lived and which ones disappeared instantly. For young performers stepping into fame for the first time, navigating his expectations became an unspoken part of the job. Some remembered long shooting days where humor on the page occasionally drifted into territory that didn't quite match the innocence of a children's network. Others recalled feeling unsure about how to voice discomfort when they were still learning how the industry worked. On the surface, these moments seemed isolated, quirks of a demanding creative environment. But as years passed, they formed a pattern, one woven through countless small interactions, subtle hesitations, and instincts quietly suppressed. The sets remained brightly lit, the dialogue playful, the laughter loud. Yet behind the backdrop, a different mood lingered. People sensed that certain boundaries were unclear, that certain choices felt puzzling, and that questioning them risked disrupting a machine that had become too successful and too dependent on one man to stop. What began as faint signals would later grow into the central questions surrounding Schneider's legacy. Over time, the unease that had lingered quietly behind the scenes began to move into the public sphere, carried first by former employees who reflected on their experiences with a clarity they hadn't felt comfortable expressing years earlier. Social media became a catalyst, resurfacing scenes that once felt harmless, but now appeared tinged with questions about intention and appropriateness. Compilations were shared, discussions unfolded, and viewers who had grown up with Schneider's shows found themselves re-examining moments they had long accepted as nostalgic. At the same time, former writers and crew members began speaking more openly about the pressures of working under a figure whose authority often overshadowed any sense of balance or mutual respect. Their accounts painted a picture of an environment where professional boundaries sometimes felt blurred, and where voicing discomfort seemed risky in an industry where opportunities were scarce and reputations fragile. This gradual shift in public perception gained momentum when Nickelodeon announced its separation from Schneider in 2018. The announcement was brief, framed as a routine business decision, yet the abruptness of it sparked a wave of speculation. The network's silence created a vacuum, one that the public quickly filled with questions about what had truly been happening behind the studio doors. As more accounts surfaced, the narrative surrounding Schneider shifted dramatically. What had once been viewed as quirky eccentricities of a powerful showrunner now formed a mosaic of concerns, prompting a reckoning that had been avoided for far too long. The turning point came when the conversations that once lived only in private finally reached a scale that the industry could no longer ignore. In interviews and long-form investigations, former collaborators described a work environment shaped by intense pressure and an imbalance of authority that made it difficult to question decisions or raise concerns. Their accounts were not explosive in isolation, but together they revealed a pattern, a culture built around a single dominant figure, where boundaries felt flexible and oversight felt distant. Then came the documentary, assembling years of testimony into a narrative that struck at the heart of Nickelodeon's public image. Through interviews, archival footage, and newly surfaced accounts, it illustrated how the environment around Schneider had evolved into something far more complicated than the cheerful shows he helped create. It painted a portrait of a workplace that relied heavily on silence. Silence from those who feared losing opportunities, silence from those unsure of how to challenge authority, and silence from a system that thrived on routine success. While the documentary did not claim criminal conclusions, its impact was seismic. It reframed Schneider's legacy in a way the public could not look away from. The man once credited with defining a generation of children's entertainment now faced a narrative centered on accountability, oversight, and the long-term consequences of unchecked power. For many, this was the moment when the divide between the joyful world on screen and the concerns behind it became impossible to reconcile. What ultimately allowed Dan Schneider's influence to grow unchecked for so many years was not a single decision or failure, but a system shaped by pressure, dependence, and the illusion of stability. Nickelodeon was built on a formula that Schneider consistently delivered: shows that captivated young audiences, performers who became cultural icons, and storylines that defined a generation's sense of humor. With each success, the network's reliance on him deepened, creating a dynamic where questioning his methods felt not only inconvenient, but potentially disruptive to a machine that appeared to be working perfectly. Inside that environment, silence became a form of currency. Writers hesitated to challenge creative choices layered with ambiguity. Crew members weighed the risk of speaking up against the reality that opportunities in children's television were limited. And young performers, many experiencing fame for the first time, often lacked the context to recognize when boundaries felt unclear. The industry itself contributed to the problem. Fast-paced production schedules, intense competition, and a long-standing pattern of prioritizing output over reflection. Schneider's rise became a case study in how a powerful figure can operate within an ecosystem that rewards success more than scrutiny. It is a reminder that collapse rarely begins with a single moment. It begins with years of overlooked discomfort, normalized behavior, and the belief that as long as the product shines on screen, whatever happens behind it can remain unseen. Today, Dan Schneider's legacy stands suspended between two conflicting realities: the undeniable impact of the shows he created and the growing scrutiny surrounding how that impact was shaped behind the scenes. For countless viewers, his work remains woven into childhood memories, moments of laughter, comfort, and familiarity that once felt untouched by complexity. Yet for others, the revelations that have surfaced reshape those same memories, casting them in a different, more complicated light. The conversation now extends beyond one man and into a broader reflection on how the entertainment industry protects its young performers, how power is granted, and how long it can remain unchallenged before consequences emerge. Schneider's story highlights the fragile balance between creativity and responsibility, between the joy presented on screen and the environment required to produce it. And as the industry continues to evolve, it forces audiences to confront an uncomfortable question. How do we reconcile the nostalgia we grew up with when the truth behind it was far less simple? Whether Dan Schneider's name will be remembered with admiration, caution, or both remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: the world behind the smiles was never as bright as it seemed. And understanding that may be the first step toward ensuring that the next generation's stories are created in spaces worthy of the young people who bring them to life.